Hello, and welcome back to the Right Brain Podcast.
Welcome.
My parents are here again in town. When we booked this time for them to come down here, I forgot to tell them that it was CMA Fest. So
Yeah.
it is a little overwhelming.
A little loud in the hotel last night.
Yeah, everything is a little wild. But I think that you're probably going to get your hotel rooms comped because of the wild behavior. So that'll be pretty awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Listen, it's all about being here with you no matter what. And it's cool to see it. It's cool to be in Nashville during this time. I told my friends and my brother that I was coming down here. He was like, oh my God, I was there like 2 years ago during CMA Fest. It was so crazy. It was so great. But everybody talks about how amazing it is here. You said this is like the best time of year, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a wild time, but the shows are incredible. Everything's amazing. Yeah. You're just seeing the glass half full. But okay. So today I think we're going to talk about, primitive reflexes because we have covered this before, or we haven't covered it before. We haven't done a whole episode about it yet, but we've touched upon it. But I'm just like trying to, always kind of reiterate the things that you're talking about because these things are like the ABCs to you, but to most people, everyone's like, I have no idea what this is. So I think we're going to do like a whole breakdown of primitive reflexes for you guys because honestly, it's like, you know, what a lot of it is like your life's work, like all the research you've done and it's so important to you. And it just makes everything make sense. And I don't think that it's been explained to us this way before, so it's like also just very rare information that you hold.
Well, you know, quite honestly, probably most people have never even heard that phrase other than during this podcast.
Yeah.
And most doctors don't really even know what it is, to be honest with you. I never learned it in school. And so it's a term and a phrase that, you know, you never heard of. And so how important could it be for most people? But, you know, I've obviously spent a lot of my career and education learning about brain development. And when you talk about understanding brain development, especially human brain development, to me, it's the most important single thing that you can understand is these things called primitive reflexes, or now they're referred to often as neonatal reflexes. But you know, it's something that I've spent a lot of time researching, and I've probably at this point published more than anybody in the world on it, as in regards to what's called retained primitive reflexes.
Oh, right. I forgot the retained word.
Yes. Well,
I'm just a girl.
Retained means that they didn't go away when they were supposed to. So it all starts off with that I think in psychology or psychiatry, anybody that understands some of the neuroscience realize that, you know, almost all adult mental health issues start in childhood, that it all starts in childhood. Obviously, we know we're hearing the news with things that RFK is talking about the epidemic of autism, and we've talked about that, and ADHD and OCD and learning disabilities and dyslexia, how prevalent and how we're seeing an epidemic rise of those. But we're also seeing an epidemic rise of adult mental health issues.
Yeah.
And, you know, right now, the conservative statistic is that 20% of children have some sort of mental health diagnosis, and that 20% of adults. Now, is that a coincidence that there's 20% of children and 20% of adults, or is it actually the same population that never went away, right?
Well, what do you mean?
Meaning that 20% of children became 20% of the adult population.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And even though, and those are really conservative estimates, because now it's probably much, much higher than 20%. 100%. In some populations, amongst artists, no, it's 100%. So that's the thing, is that we see this epidemic rise of mental health issues, and we talk about autoimmune issues and other things, and it's all related to brain, and it all comes back to brain development. So understanding what goes wrong and how do we identify this and what can we do about it? When we start looking at things like primitive reflexes, it becomes the number one way, I think, to identify if anything went wrong with your brain development as a kid. Not even wrong, but just went off track. And also it becomes, for me, the first target of any sort of treatment that is going to be able to really make long lasting and deal with the root cause, right? When we're talking about what is the root cause of mental health, what is the root cause of these things, what is actually happening in the brain. And it really starts with these things called primitive reflexes in most cases.
Okay. Yeah, and the way you test for primitive reflexes is just like, it's the weirdest thing ever. It's so odd to explain, but it's like, I mean, my understanding of it, and he'll go into depth about it, but it's just funny because when he would test it on me, like put like a wooden, like the back of like a wooden spoon on my hand, and if my hand clenched, she'd be like, brain's messed up.
Well, there are more sophisticated ways of doing it, but yes, if I'm in somewhere and all I have is a spoon. But yeah, it doesn't take a lot of sophisticated equipment to be able to test for these things.
Well, it's just things that you wouldn't ever know is anything to test for unless someone explained it to you. And then like when you hear the whole backstory of it, you're like, that is fascinating.
Well, one of the things to kind of resonate with people out there, you've probably seen me do this to audiences.
Oh yeah,
when I'm
times.
lecturing. And when I'm with a group of people, and even really, because remember, as we talk about, any sort of imbalance in the brain, which is almost always related to retained reflexes, usually starts more in people that are pretty gifted in the area. So, you get a classroom full of doctors and therapists at really high level of education, and I want to demonstrate these. And the first question I ask is, does anybody out there really jump or startle when you hear a loud noise, right? Yeah. So, that's something that people can relate to, that where it's almost feels uncontrollable. Like if somebody jumps out or somebody says something or somebody pops up or even something might come at you quickly, you jump or your whole body flinches or you startle really strongly, right? And that is a basic reflex. That's called a Moreau reflex. And that's a baby infantile reflex that should be gone by the first year of life or even earlier. And people may have it. So that's why it's called retained. And that's an example of like one reflex that you may see. And then that also is associated with your heartbeat increasing, or what's increasing what we call your sympathetic nervous system response. So let's get to the more of this, because honestly, I could spend 10 shows talking about primitive. There's so much information. But so again, these things called primitive reflexes, what are they? Why are they so important?
How many
especially
are there?
in humans? How many are there that we actually that are practical? So the bottom line is the human brain is unique, as we know, but it's unique in every way, and especially its growth and development is very unique. And that gives us a great advantage, but it also gives us vulnerabilities that no other animal has. So humans have the largest brain per body size of any primate. But because we're the only ones that are bipedal and stand upright, we have the smallest birth canal. So from the beginning, we have big heads with a really small birth canal. And no other animal has to deal with that. No other animal on the planet has to deal with that issue, especially no other mammals or primates. So from the beginning, we have a problem because if our brain grows too much in the womb, it won't go out. It won't get out. So that's not going to be conducive to the baby or the mother living. So we've had to, through nature, develop a way of keeping our brain or genes that grow our brain relatively restricted, so our head stays relatively small in the womb, so that when we're born, a baby's head is only about 20 or 25% of the size of the adult brain that it will have, which will be 90% by the age of 3. So we have really immature brains when we're born. No other animal has to have that, so that most other animals, most of their brain development happens inside the womb in a controlled setting. And so when they come out, they're much more advanced and mature than we are. We only have about 20 or 25% of our brain actually there when we're born. So that means that almost 80% of our brain development happens outside the womb. So all those steps that take place outside the womb all are really important for building our brain. Mm-hmm. And we have a really long time of brain development. And the biggest things develop at the end. So all of our cognitive and emotional and executive function abilities are the end result of all those steps. So any slight deviation in that developmental trajectory, what I call this developmental brain blueprint, any deviation from this blueprint actually has a big impact on our brain, where it really doesn't have that much of an impact on any other animal. So the genes that build our brain have to be able to know when they're outside and they can grow versus when they're inside and they can't. And one of the main things they do is that they're highly sensitive to any sensory input. So the genes that build our brain, which are 84% of all of our genes, by the way, that's how important our brain development is. 84% of all of our genes are active during brain development.
Wow.
And they happen to be the most sensitive genes to environmental input because they need to be able to know. So light, sound, gravity, touch, temperature, movement, all of those things, when we're outside the womb, we're getting it at a much higher level than we get it inside the womb. And now the brain knows I need to grow. But to initiate all of that, we need to be able to move. So we need to move into the world, to engage the world, to engage our senses, to create feedback, to stimulate these genes, to turn them on, to cause our brain to grow. And then we need to do that in increasingly complex ways to build a more complex brain. Mm-hmm. The problem is, because our brain is so immature, the part of our brain that moves us later on in life isn't there yet. So like a horse can run, full out run in under 2 hours after they're born.
Oh, wow.
A human, we're lucky if we walk at 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So the motor cortex, the part of our brain that will literally in our brain move us and let us move our own body, isn't there and won't be there for a while. So we need to move to build our brain, but the part of our brain that moves us isn't there. So what's the answer? Primitive reflexes. This is the reason why we have them and why they're more important in humans than really any other animal. I don't really know if animals really have them per se, mm-hmm. even though they're built on those types of movements. So primitive reflexes are these basic programmed, what we call stereotypical movement patterns that come from our brainstem, so the lower part of our brain, which is active when we're born, and they allow us to move in different ways and to feed ourselves and to interact with the world and to even get ourselves out of the birth canal to begin with. And they're critical, and they need to lead us through the first year of this development and all these stages to eventually to the point where at 1 year, basically every baby should be able to walk a few steps, talk a few words, and be able to point and have good eye contact.
That's when the reflexes are gone by that time?
And then they should go away, right? Okay. So basically, the last reflex is really on the bottom of the foot called the Babinski. And just as a baby gets up and walks at 12 months, yeah. It's a funny name, Babinski.
It's just, though, there's the things you just pull out of your head. You're like, 84%, the Babinski. I'm like, I can't even, yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Well, you do the same thing with music and with music writing and all these things that, that you do and you're professional at. So it's just a funny word, Babinski. You can't help but Babinski. Try to say it 3 times fast. But it's a reflex on the bottom of the foot that if you stroke the bottom of the foot from the bottom up on the outside of the bottom of the outside of the foot, the toes go back and the foot and the toes spread, right? So
yeah.
And that's called a Babinski. And in a baby, if you try it on a newborn baby, it'll be there. And it should be equal on both sides. And then at 12 months, almost exactly, the toes should now go down. So if you stroke it, that reflex now goes down, and now that's replaced by what's called a plantar reflex, where your foot goes down, which makes sense because when you're walking, you need to push your toes into the ground. If you rolled your foot on the ground and your toes went back, it would make it really hard to walk.
Right. Yeah.
So if a child is delayed in walking, that's one of the reasons why they're delayed in walking.
Wow.
Or if they walk in an awkward way, or they have a really unsteady gait in the beginning.
Or some of them toe walkers out there.
And
Well, I guess that's the opposite.
toe walkers is kind of not the opposite, but it's related to that. But yeah, so yes, but there is a relationship there. And that's, toe walking you almost only see in right brain deficits and in autism. And so this is where these reflexes, so, they're really important, and there are different steps to them, and some of them show up earlier and then go away, and other ones come out. But these are very important because if anything alters that brain development, then it alters the way our brain is going to end up. And especially the adult brain is the end result of what happened in childhood.
Yeah.
So, if you have a mental health issue as an adult, it can start in childhood, and it starts usually with some deviation of that normal growth and development of the brain. And
you always say it like, I don't know, that you say it's like a pyramid thing where like people, like if a kid is like dyslexic or something, then they're just like working on helping him read or whatever. It's like if you're starting at the top where now they're grown up and these are the issues and you're just trying to fight the issues there, that's not how it works. You have to go back to the beginning. Like,
right.
What are your primitive reflexes that happened and you got delayed as a child, which is what grew into you becoming this way. And now we have to go all the way back to the beginning to see what happened there. You have to look at the root cause. Yeah.
And that's, what all my work has really been about. And, almost nothing out there in traditional therapies really deals with the root cause. Because in medicine and psychology, their attitude is mostly like, well, we don't know the root cause.
Mm-hmm.
We're never going to be able to know that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make any sense because obviously, why can't you know it? It comes down to really understanding neuroscience and brain development and how this all works and how it interacts. It's like, if you had a building and the roof kept on cracking over and over and over, and you patched it and it cracked, and that you can do that. But if you go back and say, well, why is it cracking? What's the root cause? And you go back to find out that the foundation wasn't laid evenly, that there was a little bit of
That's
a
a pretty
tilt.
good analogy.
I use it a lot.
Well,
because building the brain is like building a building or a home. It starts with the foundation, and that's how the brain starts. We build from the bottom up in layers, and then the brain grows, and then it comes down and regulates everything. So ultimately our brain, top down, is supposed to regulate everything: our immune system, our digestive system, our muscle tone, everything, the way we perceive and filter sensory information, and also obviously control our thoughts and the way we process information. But when I use the analogy, I usually even show a picture of like a foundation and a building, where if you're building a house, you have different floors, and then you're going to build a roof. But the foundation needs to be solid. If the foundation is not solid, then nothing on top of it is going to be solid.
Yeah.
And in the brain, the foundation of the brain is the brainstem. And that's where all the reflexes come from. And when we say that the base of the brain needs to be solid, the foundation needs to be solid, that means that it needs to be fully mature. And if those reflexes are there, that base has never fully matured.
And you can just be like a Tower of Pisa out here.
Exactly. That's another good analogy. There you go.
Thanks.
That's your Italian creative part. But yeah, that's a perfect example. Like you look at that, that's, the Tower of Pisa leaning there. And if because it leads to these imbalances.
Right.
And that's the thing. It not only delays, so what does it do? And so one of the, I've done like the only really relatively large randomized age match controlled double blind study looking at retained primitive reflexes in autism spectrum in children, adolescents, and adults. And we published about 10 papers on this so far in some of the best journals in the world. And so the idea was, first of all, pediatricians are typically trained in looking at these, but even though they're trained, they never look at them in practice. Pediatric neurologists are trained, but they only look at them for the first year because they know that they're supposed to be gone at the end of year one.
Right.
So they never look beyond that. So if the reflexes are still there beyond one, that's when they're called retained primitive reflexes. And in traditional pediatric neurology and pediatricians, they typically say there's no such thing as retained reflexes. They go away at one, automatically, all the time,
No, but
without
I've seen
fail.
them on people because I've gone to your lectures and we all do it to each other, and I've seen them on full-grown adults.
Exactly. But if you say to a pediatrician or first of all, pediatricians don't look at them. And I have pediatricians and someone that, works with me now and tells me, she's been in practice for 30 years and she didn't have an interview of her on my Instagram. And she said, I don't look at any of these. I never look at them. I learned about them, but I don't look at them. And she'll tell you, I don't really know anything about brain development. I have no idea. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, pediatric neurologists, if they'll look at it and they'll say, well, there's no such thing as retained reflexes. And if you ask them, have you ever looked at a child or anybody after one and looked for reflexes? And they'll say no. And I say, why not? And they'll say, because I know the reflexes are gone. Well, have you ever looked? No. Well, how do you know? Because I know. But you've never looked, right? That's literally the way if you don't look, you obviously never see them. Mm-hmm. But the literature out there clearly states that even in normal populations, somewhere between 5 to 27% of the population still has some retained primitive reflexes, right?
Yeah.
So, it's out there, but they have no clue about that.
Right.
So in our study, we wanted to look at a couple things. One is there such a thing as retained primitive reflexes? And that's why we looked at children, adolescent, and adults. And we were able to show clearly we had multiple doctors all look independently who were trained to look for primitive reflexes and all identified that, yes, these reflexes are there.
I can use it as a party trick sometimes. I'll just
Absolutely.
whip it out. I'll be like, let me see your hand. Let me see the bottom of your foot. Oh, brain development, a little off.
Or just go up behind them and clap real loud. And
well,
see
honestly,
if they jump.
I still have that one. So
that's my favorite one. But so the other thing was, okay, so let's say they are retained, and we pretty much proved that they are. Other people have also, done research on this as well. But then the question is, so what? What does that mean? What impact does it actually have on the brain?
Right. And how would you go about fixing it?
Right. And nobody really, quite honestly, has ever really answered that question before. Like, okay, well, we know that there's a relationship, or we believe there's this relationship between retained reflexes and different types of childhood and even adult disabilities, even though no one really ever talked about it in adulthood until I started really looking at it. They just looked at it in children and said, okay, children with ADHD or learning disabilities or dyslexias, they have these retained reflexes. They never said, well, do adults have these reflexes?
Yeah.
And I showed, and that's probably another story, but yes, we've been examining doctors and therapists. We would have them test on one another and we'd find them there all the time. And I was like, oh my God. So obviously if they don't go away at one, they may never go away.
Right.
And they stay there for your whole life unless you do something to get rid of them at some point. And so what do? What they do is if they don't go away, now they're supposed to lead you through this early brain development in the first year and get your brain to mature and become more complex. And then they should go away and allow you to have more complex freedom of movement now that your motor cortex is built and you can control your own movements and you interact with the world in more complex ways and build a more complex brain. And now you build the next level and then the next level and the next level. And then ultimately cognitive abilities emerge out of that part into the brain, out of the brainstem into the brain. And then once you complete that process, now the brain comes down and regulates everything. And so that's the way the brain should mature. If the reflexes don't go away, now they hold back brain development. They keep the brain in a more immature state. And because there's this sequencing that we've talked about of how the right brain takes the lead in development in the first 3 years, and then the left brain, anything that alters that sequencing in any way, for whatever reason, can alter the way the brain grows and then alters whether there's going to ultimately be this balance at the end of 6 years when both sides of the brain really become the right brain and the left brain.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So what we were able to show is that if the reflexes don't go away, they hold back brain development, keep it in a more immature state, but then they can lead to these imbalances where they can either then stop right brain development too early and the left brain comes online too early, or the right brain slows down and then it becomes too dominant over the left and prevents the left brain from coming online too early. But either way, these imbalances start, and there's other things that can create these imbalances, but having retained reflexes is almost always going to lead to an imbalance. So the two real root issues, and really a lot of this goes back to what starts it all. What starts it all is that there may be something either prenatally or in the womb or during the birth process that alters the expression of genes that build the brain, that cause the brain to be slow and it's a little bit behind. These reflexes aren't showing up when they're supposed to. And so that's where someone may miss a milestone. They may not, like the first milestone for me outside the womb is when a baby should, if a mom chooses to breastfeed, a baby should be able to latch on without any problem. 85-90% of the kids that we work with, especially the kids that don't speak, could not latch on initially. Yeah. And that's called a rooting and sucking reflex. And that's one of the first reflexes. And if a baby can't do that, or, and a lot of moms, of course, blame themselves and say, well, I wasn't producing enough milk, which may be true, but, it may also not be. It may be that the baby wasn't really able to latch on fully, or the mom may need to use a nipple shield, or it could be really painful. None of those things should happen that way. It should be a really natural process.
Yeah.
And if it isn't, why? And the reason is that the rooting and sucking reflex isn't there fully when it's supposed to, and the baby's having a hard time really doing that. And the way the quality of the way the baby latches and sucks is what actually helps to stimulate what's called oxytocin in the woman's brain that creates the amount of letdown of the milk. So if you're not producing enough milk, it's not often the mom's fault. It's more that the baby wasn't stimulating that whole reflex as much.
Wow. Okay, that's incredibly fascinating. Okay, so that's one of them. How many reflexes are there? 9?
Well, no, there's actually about 30 or 40, but for me, I've looked at all of them.
Yeah,
but for me, it's come down to about 8 to 10 that I think are critical.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, so could you run through those?
Yeah, so the first one is the rooting and sucking reflex, as we talked about. And this, you can see it in a baby. If you stroke their cheek, their mouth should open, their mouth should turn, and they should open their mouth as, to latch on. And then once they latch, they should be able to suck. There's another reflex that relates to rolling over, which is the next milestone. A baby should roll over at around 3 to 5 months to both sides, front to back, back to front. And they should be okay being on their belly. What you hear all the time with kids that have issues or with people that are adult with mental health they may say, my mom said that I was terrible at tummy time. Like I hated being on my belly. No baby should hate being on their belly. If they do, it's a red flag. And if they're not rolling over. So there's what we call the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, that if a baby turns their head one way or the other, if the way they turn their head, the arm and the leg on that side will extend and the other arm and leg will flex. And so it's like this.
Yeah.
So it's like when they move their head, all of their body moves. So it's almost like being a puppet on a string, right? There's another one called the tonic labyrinthine reflex. And many of these reflexes are there because they're there first to get the baby in the right position. So a baby miraculously around the end of the third trimester should automatically get into the right position, upside down and backwards. And they should be doing that without the cord get wrapped around their neck or their body. They should be deep enough down that when they're in the right position, they induce the water to break and that for the birth process to move forward. If a baby is not in the right position, if a baby is breech or is what we call sunny side up, or if they're stuck, or if they're not deep enough down in the canal where the mom needs to be induced, why? Mm-hmm. And the reason is these reflexes aren't there when they're supposed to be, or they're not as strong as they should be.
Right.
And they're not getting the baby to do these automatic movements at the right time. So the timing is off, right? The baby is 9 months, but their brain isn't 9 months and their movements aren't where they should be at the right time. There's this mismatch, and that usually leads to a C-section. And then the next time you're supposed to use these reflexes is to literally babies birth themselves out of the birth canal. So these reflexes to be able to, so again, being able to twist down the birth canal. When they come out of the birth canal, they go down to the right. How do they do that? They do this with this asymmetric tonic neck reflex. When they turn their head, it helps them to twist down the birth canal. Then there's another one called the spinal galan. If you stroke either side of the spine on a baby, they'll flex like into it.
I know. Yeah, I've seen that on people.
Yeah, so that is so the baby can push themselves out of the birth canal, and especially near the end. I have a lot of moms who, again, they needed forceps delivery, or they needed a vacuum to help get the baby out, or the baby was out and then got kind of sucked right back in, and they had to push on the baby. That should never happen. Why is that happening? Because the baby's not really doing their part of the job. They're not, those Stupid reflexes baby. Aren't there, lazy baby. And then there's another one called the tonic labyrinthine reflex, that if a baby flexes their head, their arms and legs will collapse, right? Flex. Yeah. And then if they extend, their whole body will stiffen up. And that's when they come through the birth canal, they're in this flex position initially. And then as they come through the birth canal, their head extends and their whole body kind of propels themselves out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. And so that should happen along with. And so if that's not happening, then right off the bat, to me, these reflexes aren't there when they're supposed to. There's already this delay in brain development. They're already missing, and then they may not latch on, or maybe they do and they don't roll over properly, or they're a little late in that, and then they may be late in the next milestone, which is where they should do what we call the commando or army crawl. They should crawl on their belly. A lot of parents aren't even told that that's a milestone.
Yeah, like there would be kids that like scoot or like whatever, and they're like,
right.
Oh, that's so cute. It's like, no, They should be crawling because that's literally creating the networks in their brain.
Yeah, and this kind of drives me crazy because right now, again, and I think it's part of, I mean, let's say it a little bit, and a little bit it's also part of this whole politically correct thing that even affects healthcare. Like even saying a diagnosis can actually be considered insulting to certain populations, which is, as a doctor and a scientist, it's like, this is just a diagnosis. This is just what we call it, you know, like, well, that's, you know, somebody might be offended by that. You know, that's not how we think in any way, right? But that's the idea is, we've gotten to the point where pediatricians and doctors will say, well, there's many different ways that kids can develop, and every kid develops or different ways and that's all okay. It's okay if they scooted on their butt. It's okay if they didn't crawl. As a matter of fact, crawling isn't even a milestone anymore. That's according to the CDC.
That's insane.
It is insane, but this is the accepted idea right now that, and so if you talk to pediatricians, and they don't like to admit this because, this is their main organization coming out saying, well, we've changed the milestones. And we'll say, well, what do you say when if a mom comes to you and says, my baby isn't doing this? And I've had moms say to me, they give me this list when my child's born of all these milestones. And then when they don't meet them, I go up to them and I say, well, they didn't meet this milestone. And they say, well, it doesn't matter anyway. And the mom's like, well, why did you give it to me in the beginning, right? What do you mean it doesn't matter?
That doesn't make any sense.
I mean, moms are pretty smart, and obviously they're very intense on what's happening with their baby. And if you tell them this should happen and it doesn't happen, they're going to ask questions.
Yeah, and then they're like, oh, we don't have any answers.
And that's the thing. So I say to them, well, why do you say that? What's your basis for saying that it doesn't matter or that it's okay or all babies? And they're like, well, we don't know what they'll say. I mean, what are we going to say? What are we going to do about it? And so our attitude is, let's not stress the mom out more, which I understand. Let's keep her calm because we're not going to be able to change this anyway. So let's just keep them calm and say, don't worry about it. And then if by this time things don't change, then we'll get your child evaluated by early intervention, and then they can start doing something. But they don't have any answers. But it's not based on anything actual. The way that they came up with these new guidelines was really somebody statistically analyzed it and said, well, we know now that more than 50% of children don't crawl in the typical way when they're supposed to. So therefore, crawling is not normal anymore. Because if you look at statistically, there's what we call a normal bell curve, right? It's called a normal distribution curve. And that's why when you say normal. So in science, when we say normal, we're talking about based on a statistical curve. But if you say someone is normal or abnormal, out in the world, they could look at that as, offensive, right? So if you say that, there's a deviation from norm, oh my God, you're going to make people feel bad. I'm just talking statistically, but they're looking statistically, and they chart this and say, okay, how many babies now actually crawl when they're supposed to in the way that they're supposed to? And it's not the majority anymore.
Yeah, that's not good.
So that is now considered normal, right? So that meaning that being not crawling in a typical way is now fits the statistical norm. So that now is the new norm. But that's in statistics.
Yeah.
And they're also not looking at it and saying, but on the other end of it, as we've heard a lot lately, we have this explosion of neurobehavioral childhood disorders and adult mental health issues. And so you would say, well, maybe there's a correlation.
How dare you say something like that?
Maybe there's a correlation between them not crawling in a typical way or meeting their milestones or not walking on time, right? All children should walk right around 12 months. I had a couple recently, I think they were from Norway, and because this happens all over the world. And they were telling me about this one child that we were talking about that was diagnosed with I'm not sure if it was a learning disability or ADHD, but the child didn't walk until 2. And the mom was going to the doctor and saying, aren't they supposed to be walking? They were like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And then they had another child. And that child at 1 was walking. And they were like, whoa, wait a second. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
And this whole child, they were able to see. And if you're a first-time parent, you don't know. because you don't have any example.
Yeah. Also, obviously, all these things are fixable. It's not like horrible. Like everyone has retained, not everyone, but like a lot of people do.
I would estimate
so it's not like
probably,
this is like the end of the world, but it's important thing to see and to acknowledge.
Yeah,
and it's a real thing.
It's not meant. It's meant to actually say, okay, where's the root cause and what can we do about it?
Yeah, because then when you find it, you can.
That's the thing. You can change these reflexes and get rid of them at any age. Relatively simple, with non-invasive, and usually within a year, you can get rid of these reflexes, even if they're all fully retained. Mm-hmm. And that's the point. And that's how you can change the brain significantly. But the way I look at it, it's like, if you have a computer and it's relatively old and you want to upgrade it, and it says, no, you can't upgrade your software because you have this old software that's still there, or, you have to delete some things, or you have something that is in the background corrupting it. And it's, even though the computer may work and it may be okay, and it may have been a really expensive computer and a great computer, but it's not functioning at its optimal level because this old software was in the background constantly slowing it down. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is.
Another great analogy. Really, these are good.
I just thought of that now. So it's like that. It's like, as our brain every year, especially early on when we're growing, it's like our brain gets a new upgrade. We get a different, a faster processing chip. And we should have this, one on the right and one on the left, and they should match relatively. If they're too far apart, then we can't synchronize, we can't communicate, we can't link up the information. And so each year, basically, we get an upgrade. But what happens is that if these reflexes are there, they keep the brain in an immature state, and it's like this old software never goes away. It's always there in the background.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's going to prevent the upgrade from happening. And now one side may be getting upgraded and the other one isn't. And then that imbalance, it's like, if you have an old piece of technology, you can't synchronize it with your new technology. Your new iPhone may not sync up with, your old Apple computer or something, just because they're different processing speeds.
Yeah, that puts it in perfect perspective for sure.
Yeah. So it doesn't damage anything. It doesn't break anything. It just keeps things operating at a slower state. It keeps the brain in a more immature state, and it slows down certain networks, which may cause other networks to speed up too much, and then this leads to an imbalance. Yes.
Yeah. Wait, okay, so I don't know what you said, maybe 5 of them?
Well, we said rooting and sucking. Yeah. There's another one around the mouth called a snout reflex that if you push on it, your lips automatically pucker up, like involuntarily, like you're blowing a kiss or something. Okay. Then we said asymmetric and symmetric tonic neck reflexes. Right. Then there's the tonic labyrinthine reflex. There's the Moreau, that startle response we talked about.
I have a question about that, actually, because I feel like when I was a kid, I feel like I had a Moreau, but mostly because Robbie and Ty were like locking me in the basement and I would like lose my mind. So I was always scared of things. But I feel like for a while it like went away. And then my friend Ashton, who is the most gentlest little person, but we were living in the same house, and I would see her like anytime I'd like come down the stairs, she would just be like, I'm here. But I wouldn't hear her, and I'd come down and I'd be like, ah! Like she actually caught me on our Ring camera. Like it's so crazy. I'm screaming. But I feel like it wasn't like that for a while. But she was saying to me that maybe because we started living together after I like was in a very unhealthy relationship where I was like scared of the person, that maybe, I don't know if it came back because of that. But now it's like, I just walked out of my new apartment and I turned around and there was a guy just waiting for the elevator. I was like, oh my God. And I like screamed at him. He was like, I'm sorry. I was like, what are you doing? Just standing there. He was like, I'm waiting for the elevator. I was like, don't do that again. We're actually like friends now because it was a funny situation. But Yeah, and it happened again at the Apple store the other day. I was just sitting there, and the guy that I was waiting to get me from the Apple store tapped on my shoulder, and I like screamed in the Apple store. But it's like weird because it went away. Like I feel like I had it for a little while, and then I didn't have it anymore. I think also like from a lot of the work that we did. But I was wondering if like going through some sort of trauma or something can bring something back. I don't know, but
Well, especially with the Moreau. So in general, once they're gone, they're usually gone fully. But if they're not fully gone, they're always there. And
the Moreau also is he will like clap behind someone's back to see if they like.
Yeah, so the Moreau, there's like basically 3 or 4 different ways you can stimulate it. One is a loud noise. So in a baby, for instance, some people do this for fun. I wouldn't advocate this at all. But some people may make a loud noise around a baby and the baby jumps, right? You can see the baby will jump. And it's funny looking. But then the baby will often start to cry after that because it triggers the sympathetic fight or flight reflex. So, that's why a baby will cry. And what happens is that there's a characteristic physical movement where the arms will kind of fly up and the hands open up and your whole body kind of jerks backwards and your legs will fly like that too. And you take a deep breath like that. And then everything kind of comes back in almost like in a protective fetal position. And that's, the most classic version of it. But a lot of it is just where your hands will fly up and like extend out like that. And so it can happen if you feel like you're falling backwards. So if you're falling backwards, if your head goes back really quickly, that'll stimulate it. In some people, it could be also, like we said, with a loud sound. Others, it could, if something's coming at you quickly, like if you see something coming towards you, you might get that same reaction. Now, there is what we call an adult startle response.
Yeah, wait, so is mine not that? Because I get really startled or no?
Well, there's, normally we all have an adult startle response.
Okay.
But it starts off as the Moreau reflex. So both of them are tied into the fight or flight, right? Because when you're scared or when that happens, your heart rate goes.
Yeah.
So you may have gotten rid of the Moreau reflex, but you may have a heightened startle response, even though they're usually often related to one another. I think we had talked about in the past how when you look at PTSD, for instance,
right?
Like if you look at soldiers at war, it's about 15% end up with PTSD. And the question is, why 15%? They're all exposed to the same traumas of war. Why are only 15% of them actually truly, labeled with full PTSD? And one of the things that was shown is that in that 15%, they have an increased startle response.
Which could mean that they had a retained Monroe response.
Exactly.
Oh, God, that's so fascinating.
Yes.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And that's also true with people like with schizophrenia and other mental health issues, that they have an increased startle response. So, it's kind of one and the same. But now with reflexes, if they're not fully gone, they're always there. And they might, at certain points, if you're traumatized mentally or emotionally, they might come back. So then there's what we call retained reflexes, which is where they never go away. Or there's returned reflexes, where all of these reflexes come back with a brain injury, with a stroke, with a spinal cord injury, or even with degeneration later on in life, in neurodegeneration, like in Alzheimer's or something like that. Many of these reflexes come back, like the Babinski reflex, your favorite reflex. That is a classic sign that, any doctor that, that's been through any sort of training in neurology, that the Babinski sign is most likely been taught to you as a sign that there's a brain injury and not that it was a primitive reflex. But that's what it is. And most of the reflexes that were looked at as brain injury reflexes are actually reflexes that are really looked at initially as primitive reflexes. So they never really go away either, but they get what we call integrated into the nervous system, and they need to be inhibited, and then they can be utilized and kind of broken up in pieces of them used. But they need to fully integrate. And if they don't integrate, then they're going to corrupt, and they're going to keep the system, in an immature state, which may then lead to imbalances. And that's ultimately the root cause of most issues, because it all comes back to brain development. And movement is the reason why we have brains on this planet. I think I told you in my first textbook, we really asked this question: when did brains show up? Why did brains show up? Like, how did a brain evolve? Of course, we can say it's due to God's plan or something like that. But from an evolutionary standpoint, where did it come from? And my first book was called, Behavioral Disorders of Childhood: An Evolutionary Perspective. And what it turns out, according to the best researchers in the world that look at, evolution and evolution of the brain, that it started because of movement, that living things that don't move, like a plant, they don't have brains. Living things that move have brains. So movement is the reason why we develop brains to begin with. Mm-hmm. And movement is the main thing that leads us through brain development. And the thing that leads movement is primitive reflexes. So the most important thing to brain development is that these reflexes are coming on when they're supposed to, the way they're supposed to, and lead us through those brain developmental stages, and then they need to go away. And if they don't do that, if they don't come on, then they don't go away when they're supposed to. And if they don't go away when they're supposed to, they hold back our brain development, lead to imbalances between networks. And to me, any mental health issue that we look at, and most physical health problems, that's the root cause of all of it.
Wow. Okay, yeah, like I think, and I don't know, which one of your books do you give people, like?
Well, Disconnected Kids, my most recent version, which just came out last summer in August. Because
there's like at-home ways you can.
Yeah, we put in 2 new chapters, really descriptive chapters. The third edition, what we really added was all of this research and input on primitive reflexes. And there's one chapter in particular where I really go through a description of how to we measure them and how we look at them. And you can't really do it on yourself, but you can do it on a partner.
Yeah.
And I also have like an ebook or booklet that I've created that maybe some of our listeners can read into, because when I wrote these chapters in this new book, it was, when I first wrote it, I think it was like, I don't know, something like 50 pages. And for a chapter, that's kind of my editor was like, this is way too much information.
Yeah.
So we need to boil it down so that it fit in the book. But what I wrote was really good and even more descriptive. So I made it into a separate e-booklet that people may be able to reach out and get.
Okay.
Maybe we can put it on our website or something for them to access that.
Yeah, for sure. It's a fun little party trick, guys. Just like everyone test out if you have primitive reflexes. It's fun.
Yeah, just go behind people and clap really loud.
Yeah, see if they freak out. And if they don't, they're fine.
But what happens is, if you do that, honestly, you're going to see some people may literally fall to the floor.
Yeah.
And that's a really strong Moreau reflex, right?
Like,
so be careful. We're only joking about this.
Yeah.
If anybody gets hurt, we're not liable.
Not our fault. Okay, well, I think this was a crazy amount of information. We're going to have to do 5 more episodes on this, but I think that you went through that so smoothly, and yeah, it's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's just, when you're talking about the brain, and again, trying to really understand the neuroscience of it and how it affects human behavior and everything, that's what we're about. That's what we're doing. That's what we're talking about. And we just touched on the surface of it, but hopefully people now understand the term, what it means, why it's important, and, if they may have something, and that, as you said, message of hope, that we can get rid of those or integrate them at any period in anyone's life.
Yeah.
But the earlier we do it, the better. But once you get rid of the reflexes, if they're there, there's always going to be an imbalance. So you also need to deal with the imbalance. And that's what we've been talking about the whole time.
Okay, guys. I think me and my dad are just going to go party at CMA Fest. So we'll see you next time.
All right. Love you, honey.
Love you too.